power, here they come.
Hi, I'm Hannah Melser, and this is Green Watch. With us today is Bridget Murray, director and founder of AXE, Jessica Rangel, founder of Eyes of a Dreamer, and Yvette Ariano, who is a grassroots advocate. This show, we're going to be talking about the pollution that occurred in Houston post-Harvey. Everything from refineries ramping off and ramping on and releasing toxins, the lack of monitoring during that before and after the hurricane, and the flooding of Superfund sites in Houston. So what happened after Harvey?
Well, Harvey brought down about 34 trillion gallons of water. I think that's a number that keeps on changing depending on who you're talking to. And a lot of folks saw that as a missed opportunity to actually capture 34 trillion gallons of potable water. But what that meant for our communities was 34 trillion gallons and some of that water washing down on communities sitting along a 16-mile stretch of what is the largest petrochemical complex in the entire nation. So when you're talking about that much industry and frontline communities sitting side by side, hugging refineries, pipelines, chemical plants, that means that exposure ramps up. So everything that is considered a normal dosage of exposure for our communities, that's already elevated compared to the west side, the north side, and the south side is tripled over. We're not saying that Houston, that the west side wasn't affected. What we're saying is the east side was disproportionately affected by toxic waters and toxic air from startup and shutdown events along the refineries and chemical plants. And, you know, communities like Jessica's in Pasadena and Pleasantville over with Bridget were devastated by not only toxic waters coming from everything as large as 6.3 million gallon storage tanks, but also legacy contamination like the dredge sites over in Pleasantville and the amount of refining and transport of chemicals in Manchester.
So it seems like there's already a great deal of pollution in certain communities that got exacerbated by this flooding and the pollution that went on afterwards. Can you tell me about some of the pollution that was already occurring even before Harvey hit?
Well, for example, in the Pleasantville community, and we're on the east side as well, near 610, about a mile away from the Port of Houston, we have been tracking our own information that's available even through the EPA and the EJ screens about the air pollution that's in our area. So we have well documented the fact that we suffer from air pollution in the area. We have no monitoring systems directly in the community to avail us of that opportunity to see just how much of that we can possibly identify then who the polluters are. So knowing that we were already receiving that pollution and then to have the events of Harvey to occur, we know that we basically were exposed to additional pollution.
You said that there was a lack of monitoring in the community.
Well, the county and city, they station air monitors throughout, and the monitor that's in our immediate area is over off of Clinton Drive, which doesn't really give us a good measure of what's actually happening in the communities because of the positioning of those monitors.
Do you think that's by design? To give a false reading? So that it seems like it's cleaner than it is?
Yes.
And that's not the first time you see an action or event like that. Cesar Chavez High School was actually planned to have an air monitor by the Village Green Project, a project by the EPA, to finally have an air monitor at Cesar Chavez High School this past year. That entire project was killed by HISD attorneys along with the TCEQ and a number of different agencies to avoid getting live readings at a high school that sits right behind 3 massive chemical facilities: Goodyear Tire & Co., Texas Petrochemical, and Flint Hills Resources. So that's, again, intentional. There's a need to separate the pollution and contamination from the people. Bridget's air monitor is placed further away than where the community is, because then you can't say, well, the community is directly affected, or these students at the high school are directly affected.
And the same goes with Pasadena. In Pasadena, Texas, it is divided between 2 sections. It is the north side of Pasadena and the south side of Pasadena. In the north side of Pasadena, they are the ones that are located along the 16-mile stretch of petrochemical plants. And then the south side of Pasadena are predominantly upper-class citizens that don't get that effect. So whenever people give you statistics, most of the time they're giving you statistics from the south side of Pasadena. That's more near the south part of Houston, the Beltway and 45. They're not necessarily as affected as the low-income families that are living in the north side of Pasadena, where they have a high rate of children with asthma. They have a high rate of women with lung cancer. It is something that they have seen it as a norm now, and that is all prior to Harvey.
One thing you'll also see with these air monitors is that they're placed in areas that are high traffic. What we know about high traffic zones is that the windrows follows in that direction. So as that pollution, as that contamination and those fugitive emissions are coming up, the traffic is just zooming by, and those readings are not accurate because they're being just pushed alongside the windrows. So you're having you're having these tactics used by folks like the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which we already know is laden with oil and gas and petrochemical interest.
Yeah, yes, it is. In fact, I think the past several directors have actually been CEOs or affiliated with petrochemical companies. Most of them appointed by Texas governors. And functionally, it does not seem to function to actually protect the citizens of Texas. It seems to more function to protect the oil interests of Texas. Companies doing oil business in Texas. Since there isn't any since you can't rely on the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality or Texas EPA, I feel, or your local communities to provide this monitoring, is there any way you, as community members, could do your own monitoring, or is that just too expensive?
What we know about the air monitors is that there are multiple forms, and so what's pushed on our communities are bucket brigades, sort of bucket air monitoring that don't necessarily stand up in courts, right? They're more or less to give community members a sense of relief. Just now I know what's in the air. But we need numbers and readings that can be upheld in courts. All of that technology is very expensive and laden with red tape, so it's extremely difficult for community members to actually receive that equipment and have it on hand as these emissions are coming up.
And then also, one of the things we have to realize is that our communities that are being exposed to this air pollution the most are of low-income communities and communities of color. For example, in Pasadena, they are predominantly undocumented, and even the language itself, the language barrier, is enough to discourage them from trying to push forward to get these real numbers and these real statistics. So this is something that is not only inexpensive to the average, but for a person that not only does not know their rights fully, does not speak the language, it's something impossible.
So they've really put up a lot of barriers here in terms of cost, in terms of access, and also just knowing the science of what's going on, knowing what air pollution is, because it's kind of, you may smell something funny in the air, but you're like, what is it? People don't understand when they smell something that it could necessarily be air pollution. They might think it's their neighbor has some problem with his toilet or something like that. So there seems to be a lot of barriers.
Well, and I'd like to speak to that because I feel like our communities are constantly given this sort of portrayal that they don't know what they're exposed to, and in reality they do. They just don't know the specifics, so they might smell something in the air and they know it's coming from one of these industries. They just don't know if it's coming from the refinery, the pipeline, or the storage facility, and they don't know if what they're smelling is petroleum or another form of crude or a chemical. But I do think that and you can speak to this, but they know it's toxic. When you smell something toxic, instantly you know it's giving you a headache, it's burning your skin, your eyes, irritating your throat. So you know it's poisonous. It's just the details that aren't there.
And even if you want to report a smell, either to the county or to the city, there is still another barrier as far as the time of day and the day of the week.
Really?
So if it's a nighttime report, then it's generally someone coming the next day. If it's a weekend report, it's someone coming on a weekday. So you've reported something, but there is no immediate response to that.
Which I think would be key, because when these releases are happening, they're happening for periods of time. They're not, going on all the time. Or different things are being released. So you really need to have someone in there quickly to find out what is being released, how much of it's being released, and where is it going.
What happened with Harvey, though, was something that was expected. For those air monitors to go down prior to that storm, and there be a loophole in rules and regulations, not only by the TCEQ, but by the EPA, to actually shut these monitors off, was obscene and neglectful of communities that sit alongside the fence lines, because we were consistently exposed, regardless of weather, regardless of water, regardless of how many first responders there were. Those monitors went down, and that was neglect. You had folks who were consistently reporting smells, feeling nauseous, headaches. Again, your eyes are burning, and there's no information. That was a complete blind spot that the state permitted.
Do you think they did that intentionally? Do you think they knew this was going to happen when Harvey hit,
Definitely.
and they...
Yes.
Definitely. In Pasadena, there was reported over 40 chemicals in the water, in the flood water, and none of the residents, literally children that went outside and started playing in the flood water, none of them, their parents were not aware that there was a stay in place by the mayor of Pasadena because of the chemicals that were found in this water. They were simply unaware that children were swimming in this water, and these were, some of them were cancer-causing chemicals that they were swimming in. And the lack of information, you can just tell that the government in these particular communities is not very transparent as to the information that they're really giving to their community members.
Yeah, as to the toxicity of the water, not only was there chemical exposures, but bacterial, sewage, E. coli, things that could make you really, really sick.
Yeah.
Correct.
So, and I think most Houstonians know that the flood waters that they experienced were just toxic on a number of levels.
I think that the level of toxic, though, and how the city was portraying it as far as E. coli and typhoid and cholera was very superficial. They never hit the touchstone, which is toxic exposure. Now, the CDC actually released a report over toxic waters in areas of heavy industry, like that 16-mile stretch of Houston, right? The EPA has information over toxic waters, but at no point did the city, the EPA, or the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality release any notification to any of these communities over what that really meant. Tejas released a notice that basically outlaid to our communities, stay out of the water. There are toxic chemicals in this water. We referenced the Center for Disease Control because no one was.
Really, they didn't put anything out about how toxic the water. Obviously, I mean, it doesn't take a scientist to realize if you have a ground saturated with toxins and you pour water on that, the water is going to be toxic.
Yeah.
So they knew that was going to happen with the amount of rainfall that we were most likely going to get, even if we didn't get as much as 50 inches. We're still going to get a lot of rainfall. And they didn't warn any of those communities within an area about that stay out of the water.
And I think a lot of that, I want to also, I guess, speak to that, yes, the waters were toxic. However, in that immediate period, there were some individuals, regardless of what was in the water, they needed to escape from where they were for safety reasons. But I think the issue that Yvette is truly addressing is the fact that because individuals did not know any information about the waters, then once the rain stopped, people felt it was okay to go outside, and then there was that exposure and duration of exposure by being in those waters.
Right.
And they were not told beforehand, before the
Right.
storm hit, just like you would tell someone to get bottled water or a flashlight or candles or something. That was not, that should be part of that kind of preparation list for these communities. So you're talking about your individual communities, how they were impacted by Harvey. Can you tell me more about the dredge site?
So the dredge site that Yvette referenced happened in the Pleasantville community. We have a non-active dredge site called referenced as the Glendale dredge site at the south end of Pleasantville community, that one of the pipes that was there to remove the water from that earthen structure basically came apart. And so as the water was flowing out of the pipe that normally should have gone into the storm drainage system, it basically eroded because it was an earthen dam. So there were quite a few concerns in the community whether or not the water supply was being contaminated. So there were issues that had to be addressed to inform the community as to what potentially was their exposure because of this. And we're still waiting for the Army Corps of Engineers to come and basically repair the site.
What was the dredge site for?
It was one of the original dredge sites for the Port of Houston, where basically when they dredge the port and they remove those materials, this at one time was a location where they took those dredge materials. But it's not an active site at this point in time, but it's still there.
Okay. So that when they were making the Port of Houston and the Houston Shipping Canal, then they're dredging that waterway out. They were taking that soil, or whatever they were dredging out, the muck,
right.
and putting it there. And because they because of that area has become contaminated.
Well, at one time it was a Superfund site.
Really?
Right. But it's no longer considered an active Superfund site, so it's been archived.
So is it still toxic, or are we just going to pretend it's not now?
That goes back to wanting to take
Right.
samples of the area.
Now, we got to remember that when areas like the Ship Channel are dredged, there are hundreds of leaks that happen along those waterways whenever chemicals are being imported or exported. There are, roughly last year, as we counted over at the office, at least 16 different spills that we were able to track last year. So those chemicals are not ever fully cleaned up, right? There's no way to be 100% sure that you're cleaning everything up. Last year there was a kerosene spill, a benzene spill, and these are things that you're not watching on the news every day because folks aren't covering this sort of information. And so as those chemicals are settling down in those soils and the soils are being dredged and placed in communities like Pleasantville, then you're talking about further exposure for those communities, because as it rains in Houston, it floods. I mean, it floods. We're in the Gulf Coast. We're used to, right. Yeah. We're used to hurricanes and we're used to flooding even after light rains, right? There are different parts of Houston that flood. So it makes those waters that much more devastating because we know waters carry toxics, one, further, and two, faster. And the danger isn't removed when those waters recede. So as the waters receded after Harvey in these communities, they settled in the soils. Children went back out and played in those playgrounds. So folks returned to work, returned to school, again, being re-exposed to all of this contamination. Just like Bridget was mentioning earlier when we're talking about, well, people needed supplies and materials. How many folks, even watching right now, walked through those waters thinking they were safe just to get to a gas station, to get a bottle of formula or a gallon of water? I'm pretty sure a good amount. It's just that in these areas, it was that much more dangerous.
Or just to get out of a dangerous situation?
Right.
Jessica, will you tell us about what happened in your community?
Well, in our community, what we were seeing is that a lot of the affected ones were the children. Like we have mentioned before with the flood waters, it wasn't necessarily just going outside and playing, but if they felt that they were in a need that they had to evacuate, when you're getting 4 feet of water inside of your home, us sitting here in this round table is completely fine. We are still, our head is still above that 4 feet of water. But when you're talking about the children, it's very different. A lot of them swallowed this water. It penetrated into their hands and their feet. So a lot of kids, we were looking at their hospital reports because they were then having fevers. Our youngest one, when we opened up our distribution center in the southern part of Pasadena, we realized that a lot of the mothers were coming back about twice a week for things like diapers and medicine. And so we were questioning of why was it they needed so many diapers, where their infants were already sick with diarrhea. They already had stomach viruses because they had swallowed this water. And so when we went ahead and we partnered up with one of the local doctors, and the following day, our youngest patient that had to be taken into the emergency room because they were already contaminated with the chemicals in this water was 5 days old.
Oh my goodness.
5 days old. She had just gotten out of the hospital, and she had to go back to the hospital because she had already had swallowed some of the water that was filled with chemicals.
And that would put, I would think, the mother at risk too.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
Because she would have been in the same environment, just having given. I mean, that's a very precarious time in a woman's life after birth.
Definitely, and as well when the new mother, or even whenever the child is a couple of months old, you're breastfeeding.
Yes.
So whenever situations like that happen, that maybe it's not on the child, it's the mother. Whenever you're breastfeeding,
Passing it through.
you're passing it through to your kid.
And you wouldn't even know about that.
Yeah.
You could be her, and you could not even know.
And they would have never guessed that it was something in the water. They just assumed that because their ACs broke down, that they were exposed to the heat. The parents never assumed that their child had been infected with these chemicals that were in the water. It had never occurred to them that there was chemicals in the flood waters. So that just shows the lack of information that is being shared with our communities, and the preparation as well. There was no sense of preparation of basic need. When you are surrounded along these petrochemical plants, that should be one of the main criteria, that should be like a fire drill, like a preparation drill when a chemical spill, and there's simply no steps towards that. No, there's no steps of precaution except for close your windows.
And I think what Jessica is also speaking to is the fact that we're, the vulnerable populations, the mothers, the infants, the elderly, because we did see some examples in our community where individuals who had possibly been placed on hospice, or so they were already dealing with pre-existing conditions, and to see that within a 7-day period, I was attending 4 funerals
Really?
post-Harvey.
Just from exposure to those chemicals. I mean, people are already kind of vulnerable.
I would say that there is a linkage because of the fact they were already in a vulnerable state, and then you had the stress of the situation, and then you don't know what all they might have been exposed to in their homes, because some of them did have floodwaters in their homes.
So when we're talking about, environmental justice or environmental racism, it's multi-sectional. There's so many issues. There's a lack of health care. There's being low income in communities of color. I think, Bridget, you summed it up perfectly. It's, you got environmental stressors as the storm is going on. So again, back to everything is exacerbated, tenfold, and you have these devastating after effects in our communities. And to what Jessica was talking about over children exposing or children ingesting this water, there are no reports on toxic exposures. There's no wing in the medical center, a center that's world renowned, that has a massive cancer research center, program, and that focuses on toxic exposures. That's absurd. You have 16 miles of nothing but frontline and environmental justice communities. And in a city with that large a medical center, we don't have one program that focuses on toxics?
I think that sounds like by design. I mean, think about it. If people knew how dangerous it was to live there, no one would live there. In fact, I don't know if anyone would live in Houston. I'm pretty far away from that toxic area, but still, I smell things that come over there. I can tell when the wind shifts. I think many Houstonians can vouch for that experience of, oh, the refinery is blowing in this today. So what can these communities do to proactively prepare themselves for a spill, or worse yet, an explosion? Is there anything they can do themselves, or?
Well, go ahead, Bridget.
Well, my answer is short and kind of condescending. Where is the emergency management plan from the city?
That's true.
You're asking about the community level, but from the city level or county level, exactly what have they put in place? for us to work with.
The city focuses on tropical storms and hurricanes and floods. They don't focus on frontline communities. They don't focus on those toxic exposures we're talking about. They're at no point in the emergency management office do they speak on these issues except for one, and that's a shelter in place, which we're all very familiar with, right? You shut your windows, your doors, you turn off your air conditioning, but how feasible is that in 97-degree weather in the middle of August? It's not. And without the proper communication and the proper channels that we've been championing this entire time, when we're talking about forming real evacuation methods, tried and true information being exchanged between these plants, like what happened in Arkema, right? Being transparent with the chemicals, the effects of these toxic exposures, how far they do stretch, so that our communities can make a sound choice. But instead, all of that is shrouded in red tape and bureaucracy in order to keep these companies out of courts.
I didn't mean to say that the community should come up with plans. I just thought it was a foregone point that the local Texas government wasn't going to make any kind of plan. So, barring that they were obviously not going to do that. I mean, it would be great if the city of Houston or the Texas Environmental Commission or anybody, a mayor, any mayor of these communities, we would step forward and say, hey, we're at least going to put together a plan so we can effectively respond when this happens, because it's not an issue of if it's going to happen, it's when. There's going to be hurricanes. There's probably going to be more hurricanes. There's going to be spills. There's going to be explosions. That's what happens when you have refineries this close to this many people.
Right. Well, so because we're not seeing an emergency management plan come from the city, one of the things that ACTS is working on through our partnership with the Historically Black College and Universities EJ Consortium, we will be working on an emergency plan for our community. Now, will that happen overnight? No, it will not. But the resources through Texas Southern, Dillard University, we plan to be working with them directly to develop a plan for our community. Because we have to be more proactive in these situations. For example, in our community, we're landlocked. So when the floodwaters came, 610 freeway, which is in basically my backyard, it was up to 16 feet. So, so it was all the way up to the rail line. So, and then we had I-10. So we're kind of a landlocked community. How could we evacuate? We had to wait until the waters basically receded before individuals could actually leave the community, or they could make it as far as certain places and they couldn't go any further.
I think a lot of people didn't evacuate. They didn't think it was going to be as bad, or they thought it was going to be like Rita again and remembered that experience and thought, I'd rather sit in my home and be hot than sit in a car and be hot. I like what you talked about when you said people could either shut their windows and air conditioners are off or go outside. It's kind of like die of chemical exposure or die of heat stroke.
Right.
Like, it seems like a very untenable option.
Right. And I think that brings it back to Bridget's point, is where is the emergency management plan there? Because it's one thing to say, well, what can community members do? Shelter in place. But is that a real option? You know, and at what point is it not? And then what is the alternative? So, I mean, what we're doing here at this table is that we're all grassroots organizers, and we encourage people to become involved with our organizations, whether it's Eyes of a Dreamer and, you know, DACA, whether it's ACTS and Achieving Community Tasks Successfully in Pleasantville, whether it's Tejas, because it's together, it's groundswell and from the bottom up that we're really pushing for change. We're pushing to have an interagency meeting with the EPA, with the TCEQ, with Houston, the city of Houston, and multiple municipalities, with emergency management and first responders, so that together we can formulate what this plan looks like. We're in those beginning stages of those talks, but we need more community support in each of our communities so that we can put pressure on politicians and local officials and all of these agencies.
I think also another thing is that we need to realize that when it comes to climate change, it's everybody's affected by it, regardless of your views in politics, regardless of where you stand on certain issues. There is no denying it, right? That climate change is the now. It's no longer the future, and we have seen it, and it's shocking that we still haven't seen any sort of urgency from our elected officials. When we even prior to these hurricanes, we have had devastating spring showers since 2015, where we had gallons and gallons of water all over the place. This is something that's now happening on an annual basis. And for them to not see that we are now in our third year in a row where we have had record-breaking waterfall, and for them to not see the urgency in doing a preparedness plan as of now of what should have been done yesterday is completely absurd. And it just shows to you where their priorities are, right? Just speaking bluntly, and how essentially this is the minorities in the most affected communities, the most vulnerable, are not on their top of their priority list.
Right. I would just like to break really quickly to do some announcements. Coming up is the 15th annual Peacemaker Award dinner of the Houston Peace and Justice Center. It's it's Saturday, November 11th at the Crown Plaza Hotel at 6 p.m. The Peacemaker Award winner and speaker is Chief Arvo Lookinghorse, the spiritual leader of the Ogallala Sioux and the Standing Rock Water Protectors. The local Peacemaker Award winners this year are Jacqueline Batiste, host of the radio show People of the Earth and longtime activist for the rights of Indigenous people. Second place goes to, second winner is Diane Wilson, the environmental activist organizer and co-founder of Code Pink and Water Protector. Third is Texas Organizing Project, or TOP, rising from the ashes of Acorn to fight for immigrant rights and economic justice. Before the dinner, there is a separate reception for Chief Lookinghorse, and along with the dinner, there is an art auction. For details and tickets, please go to hpjc.org. That is hpjc.org. Now back to our discussion. You were saying climate change is real and happening, and it's going to affect everybody. Could you also say that kind of pollution's the same way? A lot of people think, oh, pollution's happening in that community over there, it's not going to bother me over here. But the thing about pollution is that rain will wash that stuff right to you. Air will blow over to you. You can't like erect invisible air barriers between you and the people that don't look like you, and just the pollution just stay over there and affect them. So how do we get over that, like, almost cognitive dissonance about that pollution can happen to people in rich white neighborhoods just like it can happen to people in less socioeconomic, less privileged areas as well?
I think one of the main things that we should start breaking is that climate change is not just pollution. Climate change is tornadoes. It's drastic amount of snowfall. It's earthquakes like we saw in the city of Mexico. In Houston alone, we had never seen tornadoes like we saw after Harvey, and now we're seeing them building up in places like Cyprus and Katy as well. So I think that the people that have that mentality that climate change is just pollution, or the frontline communities that are around the 16-mile petrochemical, that itself needs to be broken. That mentality needs to be broken, because it isn't just those communities. If we were going to get in that mentality, then I would say I don't want to prepare for what could possibly be a tornado, because that's not the case, right? It's just in general, and I think that in itself we need to stop breaking and idealizing that if I move to a further away community, I'm not going to be affected by climate change. That in itself is ridiculous if you think about it. It's something that's affecting all of us. The heat strokes as well. It's not just something that we're not getting 100+ degree weather just in the front lines. That's in the entire Texas alone, that every single year we're record-breaking heat. So that's just something to think about as well, and take into consideration whenever we turn our backs on issues like climate change.
I mean, there's a preponderance of evidence that's happening. It's just kind of how in your face does this need to be before you wake up and
Yes.
realize it's in your face?
Yeah. One of the examples that we were giving is that there was over 34 trillion gallons of water that was dropped in the U.S. by Harvey. And just to kind of give a comparison to that, that is the Niagara Falls going nonstop for 509 days. Just to give you an example of how much water was dropped in the U.S. by Harvey. And not only Harvey, Irma in Florida, Maria in Puerto Rico, what it's done to those islands, how much more. And even once the limelight has gone away, like it's happened right now in our communities, there's no more coverage on the aftermath of Harvey. There's no more coverage on what happened with Florida and the aftermath of Florida. Even that in itself, it's something that should be eye-opening of the aftermath of what's going on. And not only with that, when the money is coming in to do restoration in these communities, also comes again gentrification, and once again pulling away our community, our low-income communities, because they will no longer be able to afford the places that they once lived in because they've now been restored.
That's a great way to sum it up. Bringing up climate change and how much water was dropped in, just looking at the west end of Houston, that took in a lot of water. On the east end, we're talking about toxic waters, but water alone, I mean, devastating so many communities, high income, low income, median income. As far as toxics go, you know, you can go all the way back to last year when you had the warehouse fire over in Spring, right? Spring Branch. And it was a warehouse that was holding, however, God knows how many pounds of pesticides, right? And it went on and it stretched all the way from Spring Branch through the Montrose area across downtown. And there was national footage on that entire event. Earlier today, I was at Travis High School. That's all the way in Richmond, Texas. You know, when we talk about our communities, we sit in about the 90th percentile when it comes to living next to RMP facilities that are risk management facilities. That means 10% of the rest of the nation lives in worse conditions, but these neighborhoods are in the top 90th percentile. So they live next to sulfuric acid plants that have a 25-mile radius, you know? But just because this happens on the east end, like I said, I was in the Travis High School area, Richmond, and they live in the 73rd percentile and had no idea. You have fracking that's opened up in the Houston area. Where Astroworld was, fracking is starting. We think that we're completely isolated from these subjects, but we're not. You know, like I said, fracking once ahead has started for natural gas and old oil wells, because prior to 1940, in the city limits, we fracked. We search for oil. You look up or Google Goose Creek, Texas, which is Baytown, the Baytown area, and you have hundreds of oil derricks just spiking up from the earth. And that's in the 1940s. We outlawed all of that because in the city of Houston limits, we have subsidization issues. And so part of the city was actually just collapsing into sinkholes. Why are we starting fracking again? Did we not learn our lessons from the 1940s? Was Goose Creek not enough? Because it seems like we're repeating mistakes.
There does seem to be a lot of repeating mistakes from the 1940s happening to nowadays. Unfortunately, you know, always good to have a good history lesson under your belt. So in the 40s they outlawed this kind of dangerous oil drilling and fracking within the city limits because it was causing subsidence. They probably didn't know about the toxic exposures back then, or they might have, but we certainly know more about them now. And yet we're going to go back to that, and we're doing that again. What you said about different communities really interested me. So it's not just this stretch, 16-mile stretch. It's all around Texas, all around Houston area where people are storing fertilizers or pesticides, and the community doesn't know. I mean, take the case of West Texas, where there was a nursing home and a school and apartment building right next to a fertilizer plant.
Right.
How do if I'm living in a community, how do I know if there's something dangerous like this in my community? Do I have to drive around, or?
Well, first of all, we all know there's no zoning in Houston. There's no zoning in Pasadena. there's only a say of zoning in Galena Park, that's something that's really repetitive throughout our communities. That culture needs to change. We need to stop saying this is okay. The city of Houston has responded, well, we don't have zoning, but we have ordinances, we have historical districts, we have deed restrictions and master plan communities. All of that is very beneficial to new communities popping up or well-off communities with a lot of political clout, but leaves little to nothing for low-income, especially communities of color that lack resources. We need to come to terms that everybody is exposed. Again, going back to the beginning of this conversation, we never said everyone wasn't. We said everyone is. It's just these communities are disproportionately exposed. We need to, again, come together and say enough is enough. Right? You can go onto the environmental justice screen that the EPA has, the EJ screen that Bridget referenced earlier, and you can pull up, you can type in your zip code at the EJ screen at EPA.gov and type in your zip code, and you can see all of the facilities that report to the EPA, whether it's water discharge sites, toxic release inventories, and see what is in your community. But more likely than not, you might not have a refinery, you might have a chemical warehouse holding facility, you might have a pipeline that runs beneath your property, or you might live over in the medical district area or NRG where fracking has started again. You know, no one in Houston is outside of exposure. And I would say beyond that.
Is there any kind of governmental agency or city agency that would monitor any of this, any of the fracking, any of the warehousing of dangerous chemicals, whether it's fertilizers or fireworks or God knows what else?
So within the first interagency meeting that we had with the multiple levels of agencies, one large concern was that first responders or those in charge of really kind of monitoring these facilities, it would take 10 years for them to actually cover every single facility that holds chemicals. And that's without saying that they're going to go twice a year. That's once a year for every facility that holds any sort of toxic chemicals.
Wow.
So we have a lot of unregulated, smaller facilities that do a lot of exposures and really run under the radar. And we have a lot of larger facilities like your ExxonMobil's, your Shell, Valero, Pasadena refinery systems that are so, they're almost too big to fail. So where do we fall?
So I don't know the status of this particular issue, but some 30 years ago, 1986, there was a warehouse fire near the Pleasantville community on Market Street, which basically has become an area of industrial encroachment near our community. And the warehouse fire burned for 3 weeks. The City of Houston Fire Department, which is charged with inspecting of warehouses, had no record of the last inspection, or they didn't even know what was actually in that warehouse. So there was an expose by the Houston Chronicle last year, particularly after the Spring Branch fire, and the issue is not resolved. So the monies that the City of Houston put into providing the inspectors with tablets so that they could be more efficient in their documentation, it wasn't happening.
Doesn't this put our first responders at risk? If they're going to a warehouse fire and they don't know about the toxic chemicals in there because the inspection hasn't been done and they get exposed and are injured by that or hurt by that, or even could die, where does that leave us? Shouldn't we at least do that for the first? Shouldn't the first responders at least care that they're being they're running into a situation blind?
So for 3 years, the EPA fought this issue, protecting first responders and communities, through something called the Chemical Disaster Risk Management Plan Rule, or the Chemical Disaster Rule. And it was to address all of the gaps in information that weren't being given in between industries, whatever industry it is, community members and first responders. Whether it's what toxic chemicals are we dealing with, what volume, right? Because that has a lot to do with it too. And how large of a facility, where are these chemicals stored? This is exactly what we saw at Arkema. This is what played out. So for 3 years, this rule had been worked on by the EPA. It was approved, and under the administration, there was a 90-day stay. So all of these rules and mechanisms that the EPA, that, these wonderful people brought together just to protect communities and first responders didn't go into effect. It was delayed because there were skirmishes over tiny details and technicalities. Well, this was prior to the hurricane. This was prior to Harvey. And so all the way through those 90 days, we were just waiting. Community members, first responders, everyone was excited to have safety mechanisms in place. The 90 days is done. At the 90-day mark, there was a 20-month delay under this administration, Scott Pruitt's EPA, that approved a 20-month delay until 2019 to have any safety mechanisms put in place. Tejas, along with 4 other organizations, fledged a lawsuit against Scott Pruitt's EPA because this is, again, neglect and abuse of what's going on under this administration. And during Harvey, the case was sitting inside of the U.S. Court of Appeals. The courts themselves saw what played out during Arkema and Harvey and said, you know what, we need to expedite this entire rule. So now we hopefully have a ruling coming up early summer, but where does that leave us? We asked for a delay of the delay. At least during Harvey, let the safety mechanisms go in place. Rejected. You had first responders respond to the first 2 initial fires at Arkema. They were exposed. They themselves felt the effects of toxic exposure. They themselves drove themselves as individuals in their individual vehicles to the emergency room. And now there's a lawsuit, right? You have all of the first responders who went to Arkema fledging a lawsuit against these entities because they were exposed and they felt it. We're not protecting our first responders. We're not protecting our communities. At what point do we say, again, enough is enough?
Indeed. When is enough going to be enough? When are we going to realize that this really impacts everyone's community, everyone's life? Pollution and climate change as well. It's not somebody else's problem that you can say, oh, I'll deal with that later. That's their problem. It's really quite global. It affects not only people we really value in our communities, like the first responders, but also the most vulnerable people in our communities: mothers, children, the elderly. These are the people who are going to be most affected by pollution and climate change. I wanted to ask you all about.
Can I say one more thing about Arkema? We were told that initially by FEMA officials that there were plume modules that showed that this was devastating to public health. 2 days later, they redacted their statement because of pressure from above. The last statement we got over the Arkema fire was that the fumes were only as dangerous as a campfire. You cannot have a plume as large as you did in Crosby, Texas, and tell us it is simply as hazardous as a campfire. Those were toxic chemicals.
Yeah, if you're burning uranium. So you told me that you recently got some results from working with Texas A&M on water quality. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, initially our project started about 2 years ago with Texas A&M to study the water in Manchester. Manchester, Harrisburg, over on the east end of Texas. They sliced up the entire area into 30 sections and tested the water after a light rain event. No flood water, not even heavy rain, and found 5 different heavy metals. That is chromium, arsenic, barium, mercury, and lead. All of them. And in the highest dosages, they found barium. Now, this is after a light rain event pre-Harvey. These same folks from Texas A&M came out and tested the flood waters not only in our areas because everyone at this table contributed to collecting water samples during Harvey. We're going through heavy flood waters, and here we are on the phone, just like, should we collect this water? Yes. Bridget was out there. Jessica was out there. We had other communities collect water in water bottles, you know? And so they went ahead and went through the testing, along with testing over at Superfund sites. The only information we have so far is that the occupational health department at A&M went to these folks who went out in the field and said, please tell us that you were covered from head to toe as you gathered these samples, because there's some nasty stuff in this water. So tomorrow we're reviewing what was actually in the water. We're pretty certain it was more than just those heavy metals.
I would like to personally thank you, both all of you, for taking such a huge risk to help out your community and keep people informed about the risks out there. I really appreciate it and have the greatest gratitude and respect for you guys doing that. So you said there was a lot of barium. What is barium?
So barium, again, is one of 5 heavy metals that's typically tested when you're going through water quality. The 5 different metals have everything from renal failure to endocrine disruptors to possible links to cancer, which is something that we see throughout the communities. Again, when we're talking about Harvey, it was more than just the water, right? It was also these fugitive emissions going up where you did have cancer-causing chemicals like benzene just infiltrate our air.
And there are rules on the book saying you can only release so much, or sometimes you can't release any of those toxic chemicals. But if you don't have the monitoring in place, there's no consequence to doing it. It's like if you have candy in a candy jar, but no one's looking at the candy jar. It makes economic sense for these companies to pollute because there's no economic consequence to it.
Right.
And they can make more money by polluting.
Right.
You talked about cancers in the community. Can you tell me more about that? What are you seeing? What should people be on alert for?
Well, there's a lot of our communities that are suffering from lung cancer at the moment. I know in Pasadena, in PISD, teachers are now going under training as to what to do if one of their children were to get an asthma attack, because it's becoming that common. We see it a lot, predominantly in students that are between the ages of 5 and 7 that start developing asthma. Usually from there on out, it's now second nature. And once again, our communities are so oblivious as to what is going on around them because of that language barrier, because of that fear, because there's no transparency from the elected officials that they've been going through this oppression for years now. I know particularly in the city of Pasadena that they don't necessarily link it to the pollution that they've been having to. The only thing that we have in Pasadena is probably like an alarm system test every Thursday, the first Thursday of every month. And that we don't have, it's not guaranteed that it's going to be there for every month. And that's all we have in regards to like alert you if there is some sort of chemical that has been exposed, if the pollution is higher. I mean, at this point, you get most of your information or your warnings from an app, from an international weather app, than you do from your actual city elected officials. And that's just where we are at the moment. So our community isn't linking up those high rates of lung cancer, those high rates in our students of asthma. They're not linking it up to the pollutions that they're being exposed to on a daily, because it's literally become something, they've become numb to it. They see it every single day. Pasadena High School is right, their views are the petrochemical plants in their classrooms. From a classroom, you look out the window, you see the petrochemical plant going full blast all day, every single year. It's something that it's second nature to you. So you no longer start seeing the severity of it. You're just focusing, your body's the one that's seeing the consequences from that health-wise.
We're seeing acute and chronic exposure.
Right.
So whether it's short-term exposure being, again, the irritation of your skin, causing things like eczema, irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat that really kind of simulate sinus or allergies, right? So a lot of people think they have that. Symptoms that look like colds and flus that really aren't, to long-term issues like renal failure, developmental issues, brain cancer, breast cancer, leukemia in children and respiratory issues.
And I think that we're all learning, particularly as we continue to gather data as it relates to information that's available to us through toxic release inventory. So on the EPA site, you can actually go and identify the companies that are near your community and identify what, and of course it's self-reported, what has been reported by those industries as far as the toxic releases from the companies, and then look up what are those symptoms generally associated with those chemicals. But one thing though that was very eye-opening to me after having a conversation with a representative from the Texas Tumor Registry, because here in the state of Texas, as I gather it would be in all 50 states, they actually track information regarding cancer. And that's the purpose of the tumor registry. But they don't track it by zip code.
Really?
No, there's no tracking by zip code, because it is basically the response I received is that it's considered to be personal health information.
I think that'd probably be a little too real. You would obviously see
Yeah,
a bunch of
even the
cancers in
right.
certain zip codes. And, oh no.
Just to give you background, Bridget has a nursing background, so.
So it was very eye-opening to me that the response was it was considered personal health information. Well, you can still enter that information into your system and then just do like a little cluster to
Yeah.
see what you're seeing without identifying, without
You
putting
could
any
strip
other
the identifying
Right,
data from that and just
exactly.
have, you know, lung cancer, this zip code.
But that's what happens when you have wings in hospitals in the medical center that are funded by oil and gas interest, when you have universities taking in money and, you know, kind of putting this pressure against departments who are trying to help our communities by stripping funding or anything of that sort. But again, we really encourage community involvement, whether it's getting involved with achieving community tasks successfully or Eyes of a Dreamer or Tejas. Get involved. You need to, because without getting involved, there is no pressure, and without pressure, these companies will run rampant just like they did during Harvey, just like they will afterward.
Just like they did in the 1940s.
That's right.
In our last few minutes, I wanted to ask you all, what can we do to put pressure on city officials to make changes, like enacting an emergency plan for these at-risk communities for chemical exposures?
I would like to see, I know that the city right now, the mayor has his initiative with complete communities, but I would also like to see an initiative that speaks to emergency management, particularly in these vulnerable fence line communities, because I think we are representing communities that are at higher risk.
I think what I would like to see is our community members being at the table whenever these preparation plans are being put together, because what we're seeing is a lot of elected officials that cannot relate to what we go through on a day-to-day basis, that are making these safety plans, and they have absolutely no idea of the repercussions that we have to go through. So I would like to see more of our community members at the table making these plans and being the voice of what we need.
With Harvey, there are 4 county judges that came out in favor of a regional water plan. Where is the regional air plan from Houston to Baytown and further out? We need to really talk about pollution and contamination seriously and gather together all 11 or 13 municipalities and say this is a real issue. And we need to talk with community members. We need to form emergency response plans. We need to come together and really face the issues that are affecting us.
Well, it sounds like a community effort is really what we need.
And
Bring
vote.
people together. And vote. Please vote.
vote.
Yes.
Early voting is actually going on, I believe, for school board elections.
Yes.
So skedaddle down to your local voting site. I would like to thank all you ladies for being here and for the wonderful work you do, putting yourselves at risk to help our community. I mean, I cannot think of a more honorable thing to do. And you all have my absolute highest respect for doing that. And, you know, making sure your community has a voice and is informed about the dangers they face. So thank you so much, ladies, for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
swamp and whose brow is smeared with the blood of the poor. Who rob life of its quality, who render rage a necessity by turning countries into labor camps, modern slavers and drag as champions of freedom. Sinister and cynical instrument who makes the gun into a sacrament. The only response to the deification of tyranny by so-called developed nations, idolatry of ideology.